Kyiv has its own whips. Explosions at strategic facilities are being recorded more and more frequently on Russian territory. Last night in the Chelyabinsk region, more than 2,500 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, there was an explosion at one of Rostek's enterprises, the Plastmas plant. It produces ammunition and explosives. Another facility belonging to the Saransk Mechanical Plant Corporation also came under the sights of our drones. Thank you. And the oil refinery in Makhachkala. The latter has a capacity of 1 million tons of raw materials per year. At the Makhachkala airport, as well as in Krasnodar, Penza, Pskov, Grozny, Vladikavkaz, Kaluga, and Yaroslavl, the Kila plan was implemented. Ukrainian strikes are becoming deeper, more precise, and more painful for the Russian rear. Attacks on military depots, oil refineries, and production facilities. All of this is not just a matter of the front line, but also of the economy. And the Russian economy is stalling. The budget is cracking under the strain of war expenses. How? Deep Ukrainian strikes are changing the war and inflicting significant losses on the Russian economic system. Watch the report by Svetlana Chernetska.
None of the recent Ukrainian deep strikes, as usual, made it into the news broadcast on the main TV channels. One can only guess about the systematic attacks by Ukrainian drones from the words of the anchors. They all sound like carbon copies of each other. A new powerful response to the terrorist attacks of the armed forces of Ukraine on Russian civilian targets.
In response to the terrorist attacks by the Kyiv regime on civilian targets within our country, the armed forces of the Russian Federation carried out a massive strike last night on energy infrastructure facilities.
Local governors continue to remain silent about the attacks by Ukrainian drones. In Kopeysk, a criminal case was opened not because of the attack, but due to violations of safety regulations, even though locals saw at least 3 drones just minutes before the explosions.
It's flying already, people are shouting. It's just that the camera
was late. In other words, propagandists are still using the old playbook. There are no Ukrainian drone strikes, but there are some unnamed terrorist attacks.
I'm glad that Ukraine has stepped up its campaign inside Russia, because otherwise Ukraine used to carry out long-range strikes on the aggressor's territory, but not regularly and not on this scale. We've seen these stunning attacks against Russian bombers or other targets here and there, but they weren't systematic or targeted and didn't have a noticeable effect. Now, importantly, they are aimed at areas where they will definitely benefit Ukraine and inflict losses on Russia.
Strikes on military depots, oil refineries, and defense industry plants are now happening every day. In the first half of this year, the profits of Russian oil companies plummeted by 50% according to Ukrainian intelligence, and that was before August, when the attacks became much more systematic.
If there are no further attacks, it will take Russia until the middle of 2026 to recover. That's assuming there are no additional attacks. But I assume that Ukraine will continue to target such infrastructure. So, most likely we will see a prolonged downward spiral in Russia's ability to maintain its petrochemical complex.
According to the latest count, that's from the Washington Post. Almost 40% of Russia's oil refining capacity is currently idle. They are either out of commission or undergoing repairs. At the same time, processing capacity has decreased by 17%.
The gas industry has taken even more hits, so gas exports have declined, and the burden now falls on oil exports. And this affects inflation, rising prices, and the availability of gasoline for ordinary Russians, as well as for the armed forces. Moreover, this brings the war closer to ordinary Russians. They realize that this is not a special military operation, and that Ukraine is fully capable of striking deep into Russia, thousands of kilometers away.
And a shortage of fuel is one of the very real reasons why front lines have collapsed in the past. During Operation Barbarossa in World War II, Hitler's tanks stopped near Moscow because their fuel tanks were empty, and in the Ardennes, the offensive failed for the same reason, the Reich's last offensive. Today, the Kremlin is increasing gasoline imports from Belarus and plans to lift tariffs with China. Kilometer-long lines at Russian gas stations are no longer a surprise. Either there's no fuel at all, or it's being sold at outrageous prices.
Before this, there was no gasoline at any gas station. It was a problem.
Yes, it was available somewhere. At least the 100 octane was always there, but now you just look for whatever you can get. It would seem that Ukraine has been suffering from daily Russian attacks for over 3 years, but has never faced such trouble. Thank you. The aggressor, on the other hand, is unable to restore damaged infrastructure as quickly. Russia.
Quite simply, there are no people on the ground to reconstruct and rebuild this infrastructure. The demographic crisis was predicted even before Putin's senseless war. And now, add to that, how many Russian men have died as a result of this war? How many Russians have been wounded? So let's subtract 1 million Russian men, and this will continue. So we will see significant difficulties that Russia will face, particularly in terms of employment.
The labor market in the Russian Federation is complete chaos. Prices are rising, wages are falling. Wage arrears are 4 times higher compared to last year. And the government continues to look for ways to patch the holes in the budget. They are planning to raise taxes yet again. But not for the richest, for small businesses.
Now just add another 5% on top and everything is already in the red. And we see that over the course of a year, 5 small shops around one of our locations in St. Petersburg have closed down.
Our expenses are steadily increasing.
The cost side is going up. Again, as I'm telling you, this makes the price of goods higher. Consumer demand is falling and we could simply drown in this.
There are mass layoffs across all sectors in Russia. State-owned Gazprom will lay off more than 1,500 employees, and the same number will be let go by the aircraft manufacturing corporation Rostec.
All of this is connected to the war. We know that the war is destroying the Russian economy in terms of GDP growth, which seems to be driven by defense. And this will be the first time since the start of the war that this happens next year. Defense spending will not increase because, as Putin himself admitted, they cannot keep increasing it endlessly.
This year, Russia is facing a record budget deficit. Military expenditures are putting increasing pressure on civilian sectors. The Kremlin does not have access to its assets abroad, which have been frozen by Ukraine's allies.
At the very beginning of the invasion in February 2024, I published an article called Putin's Paradox. In it, I wrote that the greatest threat to Russia's future is a man named Vladimir Putin. If Russia had had competent leadership over the past 2 decades, the average Russian would be wealthier than the average resident of Singapore or Liechtenstein. After all, this country has all the necessary resources to become a truly significant supereconomy.
The British publication The Economist writes, predictions of a complete collapse of the Russian economy are becoming increasingly realistic. The country has exhausted its reserves of production capacity and labor force and is no longer able to sustain military spending. Several regions have decided to take a radical step at once. Payments to people going to the front have been reduced 5-fold. Svitlana Chernetska details Inter TV channel.